My talk today is going to focus more on why it might not be so simple to get access to all this wonderful data that you want access to for your amazing research that you'd like to do, and hopefully shed some insight on how to make this process a bit more understandable, a little bit easier for you to deal with. I wrote my talk today thinking about what are the biggest questions that researchers ask me. As I mentioned, I am a lawyer by training. My focus is data protection law, but also I've done a PhD now, and I'm very interested in research uses of data. And the first question I'm normally asked, it's really a complaint, but it's also a question, and it's, why does it take so long to get access to this data? My research is getting delayed. I think it's a common frustration across any discipline that requires the use of data that is collected by another organization, originally for other purposes. So the data that you want to use is not really research data. I work with researchers in the Administrative Data Research Network, and I'm based in Scotland. So the context of my talk is really about data that you might want to access from government bodies, from public authorities. So it's not so much about maybe consumer data or data held by businesses. I'm more thinking about public sector data. A second question I'm often asked, and I'm glad that I heard it discussed a little bit right now, is will all my problems be solved if I either get individuals' consent or if I anonymize data? And I think it won't be helpful to go back into the details of the legislation, but I think I'm going to do a little bit of legal myth busting around that to shed some light on the different possibilities under data protection and how it fits in with you as researchers. The third and final question I'm often asked is, what in the world can I do to make this easier? This is too complicated. I don't know where to start. And as you saw from our discussion, it is a very complex topic. So again, I don't think I have guaranteed solutions, but I hope by kind of exposing you to some of the issues that you commonly will see when you're trying to get access to this data, also to bring to light the view of the data controller, these organizations, their concerns, and how you might be able to incorporate that when you're asking them for access to their data. So in my talk, I'm going to offer 3 broad answers, and I categorize these answers in terms of whether they speak to the realities of using administrative data or public sector data, or whether it requires some myth busting, if I need to clarify something. The first reality I'm going to focus on is what we very affectionately call the culture of caution, which really impedes the use and sharing of data for research. And this part of my talk will hopefully shed light on the types of concerns data controllers, so those that hold the data that you want access to, I want to explain what it is that they're worried about, and that often it's not really the law that's the main problem, and although it's complicated, it's actually these concerns about perceived controversies and potential risk in sharing data with you that is going to stop them from providing the data for your research. The second set of answers I hope to provide you today requires a bit of legal myth busting. The Data Protection Act is often used by data controllers as a shield to hide other concerns they have about their data. And while the law does provide ways for data controllers to share and use data lawfully and to share it with you for research, I think it's much more difficult to resolve the underlying concerns and fears they have about reputational damage or other risks that might arise as a result of sharing data with you. The final set of answers I hope to offer is going to suggest some ways you might reframe your considerations of asking for data in the first place, because I think just by being aware of these other types of concerns, it can really help increase your chances of getting access to data, or at least make the process a little bit more bearable. So the first question, why does it take so long to get access to this data? I think the important thing to do is just to take account of the broader landscape, to get out of the researcher perspective and just think about data more generally. And when it comes to administrative data or public sector data, this includes recognizing the many demands and pressures that are being put on public sector bodies. They are being asked to both share data for a lot of different reasons, but also to protect their data. We see in the news all the time different data breaches that are happening. So they're under severe pressure and, of course, with very little resources. There's increased calls to join up activities. So health and social care public bodies are asked to join up, provide new services, all the while trying to meet their already burgeoning demands that they have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. And of course, these initiatives, while great and in the public interest, they of course take away further resources from public authorities. There's ongoing legal obligations for public bodies to share data with the public or for other official reasons. Stacey touched on the fact that as a public body, or you mentioned that as a public body, University of Glasgow, you have to have resources dedicated to answering freedom of information requests. There's also the new sexy thing, open data initiatives. You have to make certain types of data available online. And of course, there's regulatory pressure and uncertainty. As we just listened to Stacey about, the Data Protection Act is extremely complicated, and it's going to be a little bit more complicated now with the forthcoming data protection regulation. In light of Brexit, I will mention Brexit, it's a little bit more uncertain now what data protection law might look like once the UK leaves the EU. And relating this back to the research context, we're not quite sure yet exactly how that's going to impact research uses of data. To further answer the question of why does it take so long to get access to data in the first place, I'm going to delve a little further into the data landscape, and this includes the very complex mix of laws, at least when you're thinking about the use and sharing of administrative data for research purposes. It's much broader than data protection law. You have administrative law, which are the laws that tell public bodies what they can and can't do. There's human rights laws, there's common law duties of confidentiality. So even before data protection law comes into play, any public body that you would like to share data or obtain their data, they have to find a legal basis under administrative law to do that in the first place. And some public authorities will be more restricted in terms of the reasons why they can share data for research purposes. As an example, HMRC are an example of a government department that are extremely restricted in terms of the types of research they can share their data with. And all this really is just to say that data protection legislation, privacy concerns, that's just one of many legal issues that public authorities are going to be thinking about when you come to them and ask for data. The third and final part to this answer of why does it take so long to get access to data is to consider the cumulative effect of all the internal, external, regulatory, and legal pressures. And these really combine and fuel what I mentioned is called the culture of caution, which are really the attitudes and behaviors of data controllers around their data, which we find hinders the use and sharing of data. Not just for research, it's not unique to research. They're very cautious about sharing data even within their own departments, with other public authorities, etc. Sorry. So the culture of caution, just to break it down a little bit further and what this terminology means, the first concern that we often hear from public authorities and the work that we've done with data controllers across the UK is resources. They will often lack the resources to make their data available for research purposes. It might be held in extremely outdated systems. It will be often held in a format that is entirely suitable for their internal operational purposes, but it's not going to be conducive to the research analysis that you need to do. Also, the individuals within public authorities are going to be really concerned with the perceived controversies if they share data with you. They might not have a complete and updated overview of all the data that they hold, and you, the researcher, who are brilliant, you might find something that they were not aware of and might reflect badly on themselves or their organization. Also, something I hear a lot from public authorities is it's usually down to just one person or maybe a team of 2 individuals to make this decision to share data. And they're going to be really concerned about what are the consequences for me, for my team, for my organization. What if I share data with you and there's a data breach, or the Information Commissioner's Office or the courts eventually say this was unlawful? That is a very real concern of public bodies when they're thinking about requests to share data. Another reason why data might not be shared or they might be cautious about it is that in the research context, the requests that are made for data do not often clearly communicate the incentives for the data controller to want to share data with you. And I think that's something as researchers, it's not natural to think about because we want to be objective. We don't want our work to be tainted by politics or other agendas at work. But in reality, considering the costs and risks from the perspective of the data controller, they're going to want to know why your particular research project is of benefit to them, will it benefit their service users, etc. Finally, another factor at work is this idea of ownership, data ownership. And it's something I've heard even today, and we're doing some work on the side with the Wellcome Trust on this idea. And it's not technically, legally accurate to refer to personal data or administrative data in terms of data ownership. And what we found is that when we hear public authorities use this terminology of we own this data, it's usually masking their concerns about liability, and it's because they want to keep the data closely because, again, they're scared of what's going to happen if they share data. And in our work with data controllers in the UK, we're trying to explain how, because administrative data, public sector data, derives from the public, it's not a resource that belongs to anyone, it belongs to everyone. And therefore it should be used when it's in the public interest and safe to do so, and that would admittedly use different research uses of data. What is the impact of this culture of caution on researchers? Most of you are probably familiar with this, and if you're not and you're new to this, I'm sorry if I'm scaring you away from it. You might have heard before that if you want to access a particular data set, you absolutely have to get the consent of all the data subjects, no matter how big the data set is. You might have experienced months of delays where you are expected to get 3 or 4 or 5 separate ethical approvals. And of course, each panel would want different forms, hundreds of pages long, asking maybe the same question but slightly differently, and it's very complicated. You probably are entirely unclear about what goes on behind the closed doors of data negotiation. You have no idea how these decisions are being made or what you might be able to do to make the process go faster. And I think that there's different prices that are being paid by researchers because of these delays. You might have had to change your research questions in response to a data controller's concerns. You might have had to change your research methods because an ethics approval panel has asked you to do so. And at worst, I have heard of people that have had to abandon particular projects altogether because they've not been able to access data. So what is a researcher to do with all of this complexity? In the rest of my talk, I hope to bring it up to a little bit of a more positive tone. It's not all doom and gloom, and discuss what is broadly required and not required when it comes to accessing and using data for research. And also, I want to pose some ideas of how you might be able to breach this divide between researchers on the one side and those who have the data that you want to access. So if we remember the questions at the beginning of my talk, the second one was, if I consent or anonymize, are all my problems going to be solved? Are my data protection obligations going to be satisfied? Is the data controller going to be happy? And I think it's important to go back a few steps and think about what does this question really mean and how does this relate to the culture of caution. As I said before, the law surrounding the use and sharing of data and administrative data in the UK is very complex, but the first legal myth I want to bust is that just because it's complex and it's unclear or uncertain does not mean that a particular use of data or a particular sharing of data for research is unlawful or impermissible. There are routes to using and sharing data outside of consent or anonymization. It's the legal uncertainty around these other routes to legally use and share personal data is what makes data controllers particularly cautious and often frequently say, we can't disclose the data to you for data protection reasons. They themselves might be unclear on their legal position, and again, this is going to include considerations beyond just data protection law. A second clarification I want to make is about consent and anonymization. Data controllers think of this as the safe option. This is a safe option because it's more legally tested. So when it comes to you asking for data, you're not going to be able to get the consent because it's a population level sample. They're going to be uncertain of the public interest route, which has not, unfortunately, in the courts been legally tested. It doesn't say that it's not possible, but it's not the tick in the box that's much easier. It's much easier to feel comfortable if you have a piece of paper that has an individual signature on it and you can keep it under lock and safe. If anything goes wrong, you can just say, here, I got their consent. So that's why I think consent or anonymization are used and abused to the extent that they are. And everyone here, I think, if you're on Facebook or social media, you know how meaningless consent can often be. So it's important to have that in the background. The third kind of myth I'd like to bust is about the purpose of data protection legislation. And I think the name data protection itself can be quite misleading. Of course, it provides individuals with rights and it's intended to safeguard the use and sharing of personal data. But what is often forgotten is that the purpose of data protection legislation was always to also facilitate the use of personal data in the European Union and in the UK. My own research into this has revealed that research was a particularly important form of processing or use of data, and that it was not intended to be hindered by the introduction of data protection law. So to more specifically answer the second question, will consent or anonymization solve all my problems when it comes to satisfying data protection law or getting access to data? And the answer is no. The long answer is, first, regarding consent, it's not legally necessary under the Data Protection Act to get consent. The helpful list of conditions that Stacy showed you on the slides, there's no hierarchy and there's no preferred route. What Stacy said, and is very true, is you just need to be able to satisfy whatever the condition is asking. So again, consent is not legally necessary. And to reflect back on what I said earlier, consent does not necessarily mean that the rights and interests of individuals are going to be sufficiently protected in a particular use of data. Just because you obtain someone's consent, it doesn't relinquish your other duties under data protection law to process data fairly, so to notify them, to let them know what's going on. So consent is not the panacea that everyone would like to treat it as. When thinking about large data sets, and I've mentioned this before, it's going to be infeasible, if not completely impossible, to get truly informed consent. So that's something also that you need to think about. It's not going to be as easy as looking at those conditions and just saying, yep, consent, that works, I'll figure a way to do that. You're most likely going to have to engage with these other conditions to processing that require a little bit of more nuanced thinking and doing some homework and creating arguments that would justify your research. I think if you obtain data for your research, which I hope all of you do, it's important, again, to realize that you still have to communicate as much as possible, whether it's the data controller or you as the researcher, how your data is going to be used, how your data is not going to be used. We're not using it to take decisions on individuals or cause anyone harm, and you need to be clear on what the safeguards are. Many data controllers, when it comes to their interactions with researchers and insisting that consent be obtained, it's often coming from arguments saying, we're really concerned that the public are going to be opposed to this particular data use. And I want to very briefly consider the role of public engagement. I'm not sure how many of you are aware of your public engagement colleagues in universities or whatever organizations you work with, but my public engagement colleagues in Scotland recently did some public engagement to show that a particular data set actually was in the public interest. The public were quite happy with it. It was a crime data set, and the data controllers said, we don't want you to use it. We think the public are going to be really concerned if you use that data for research. So my colleagues in ADRC Scotland spoke to prison reform groups. They have a public panel that they can kind of discuss different data ideas with and see how they feel. And once these groups were explained about the benefits of this research, they were totally fine. So it's again to say that they might be saying, we can't give this to you for data protection reasons, or we can't give this to you because the public will be concerned. There might be ways around that, and public engagement is at least a very helpful way to address those concerns about what the public views. Very quickly on anonymization, which again Stacy covered, it's often heralded as the best way to avoid all the complications of data protection law, but what I think everyone knows to a certain extent now in this field is anonymization is not foolproof at all. So it's safer to assume that you might be handling something that's potentially identifiable, and under the new regulation, it is extremely difficult to say that your data is truly anonymous. The second thing is it's a security measure. It doesn't ensure that your handling of data is entirely ethical or in keeping with your other obligations as a responsible researcher. So again, it's not the panacea that everyone would hope that it would be. So to offer a brief recap, why does it take so long to get access to data? it's extremely complicated. Data controllers, at least in the public sector, but I'm sure equally in the private sector, they're facing increasing demands to both make their data more available in more innovative ways, but also to protect it. They have limited resources, and when researchers come to them and ask for data, they are not quite clear what the incentives are for them to share this data, considering all the risk and all the resources it would take to make that data available. Second, will all my questions be solved when it comes to obtaining consent or anonymizing my data? The short answer, again, is no. Consent is not legally necessary under the Data Protection Act, sorry. And when it comes to anonymization, it is a technical solution, it's not an ethical one. So if you can remember at least just those 2 points from today, I'd be so happy. In consideration of all these realities, and I realize I've continued to be a bit of a downer, what is it researchers are meant to do? And in the last few slides I have, I'm going to offer some ideas of what can be done. I think an important first step when you're about to ask for access to data is just to be aware of the broader data landscape. Be aware of how these issues that I've discussed might be impacting the organization that you're asking data from. From the data controller's perspective, the number one issue they're going to probably be thinking of when you ask them for data is resources. How am I going to make my data quality such that I can share this data with you, but I'm also having to handle all my day-to-day stuff? Your request for data will often not be within the day job of the particular person you're asking, so you will have to find a way to justify it in those terms. Again, data controllers are often concerned about public backlash. As I mentioned, public engagement could be a really amazing dimension to add to your research, but also to kind of reassure data controllers that it's actually not exactly what you think it might be. The public is much more complex and has more complex views than you might think. Finally, it's very important to know and to be able to articulate what the incentive is for that data controller for sharing data with you for that particular purpose. As for researchers and the differences between the perspectives, I don't need to tell any of you, or I don't know at what stage of the research process you are, but there's definitely a lot of pressures in terms of funding and making sure that you stick to funding deadlines. Or when you have the funding, you've secured it, being able to make sure that any delays to accessing data doesn't mean you run out of funding before you ever get access. So these are very real issues, and I think there needs to be a way to bridge these mismatch of expectations between researchers on the one hand and data controllers. To do that, I would suggest that you would need to incorporate and account for these differing perspectives in the data access process. I think throughout the day we might hear a little bit more about details or what that data access process might look like. But for example, if you think about data controllers, and again, they're concerned of the lack of resources they have to make the data available to you, versus the researcher's concern that I have my funding already, I only have 2 years left, I need the data yesterday. In an ideal world, you would have got that data before you ever got your funding. In the real world, that isn't likely to happen, but you do need to realistically build time into your application and into your research plan, time to get access to that data. And I can't emphasize enough how much it's important to start that process early. I think an important insight from the work we've done looking at how research environments work in New Zealand or Australia or Canada is that when researchers are trying to get access for the first time from a particular data controller, it's really helpful to try and find out what their strategic priorities are. What are the policies that they're looking to roll out in the next year, and how can my research possibly address that and be attractive to them? And I think if you start from that position, you get data on an easy question that is not going to scare them away. Over time, building that relationship of trust might mean you can push the boundaries a bit and ask different types of research questions that you might also be very interested in. Another tip I've repeatedly heard from my colleagues, and Amy might speak about this today, is research questions should be as specific as possible. Data controller organizations, but also ethics approvals panels, they are not interested in fishing expeditions. For their resources and also legal obligations, they're only ever going to share data with you if it's absolutely necessary for the specific question that you're asking. So when thinking about these applications, whether it's for ethics approval or data access to a data controller, I think it's important that you couch your request in light of the data controller's concerns about liability, about reputational damage, and specifically think, what are the risks posed to this data controller by my research, if any? Is there a real risk of reputational damage if my research ends up reporting what I think it might be reporting? Or are there potential risks to their service users? Could my results somehow stigmatize a particular group of people, even if it's unintentional? On the other hand, I also think what researchers, at least those in Scotland, have been really working on is being able to clearly and plainly articulate what their research impact is. And that's in terms of the very specific publics that they intend to benefit. But when it comes to data controllers, you can be really persuasive and say, this research is lined up to XYZ policy objective, or my research is going to help you decide how to allocate your resources in the next financial year. I think when you're talking about research impact, which I will finish the presentation with, it's always usually in terms of the risk of using the data versus the benefit of the proposed research. I think another way to also look at it is, what harm or risk is there by me not being able to do this research? What questions are really important are going to be left unanswered if I can't get access to this data. So to close this presentation, I again want to emphasize this idea of research impact, because I think if you have really clear statements that you can just pull out of the drawer to explain to the ethics approval panel or a data controller or to a funder or for future funding, I think it can be really helpful. You're most likely going to see this discussed on funding applications, research ethics approval applications, but also data controllers are going to be interested in this. And it's often couched in terms such as, how is your research in the public interest? How is your research going to benefit the public? What public goods is it going to deliver? And being able to clearly articulate how your research is going to deliver in these ways, I think, is important, but it's a bit ambiguous, because who is the authority to know what is or is not in the public interest? I just submitted my PhD question on that very thing on Monday, so I could provide you an answer, but it would probably take too much time. That will be for the Viva. I think it's important to break down these ambiguous terms and just think about the three things that you might not be able to read at the bottom there. Who specifically is intended to benefit from my research? What specific individuals, what specific publics, what part of society, how will society benefit from this new knowledge I'm creating? But also, again, from the data controller point of view, how does this line up to their agenda and their priorities? What are the risks of me not being able to do this data? I think there's something really persuasive in saying what the harm is of not being able to do this research. And again, I think it shows that you've done your homework if you've also considered the risks. It's not all about benefits. You really have to think, are there even unintended consequences of me obtaining access to the data? And what impact might this have on specific individuals, society, or even on data controllers? I do have other positive things to say. I hope it wasn't all negative. If you're interested in anything that I talked about, it's on the website. So thank you.